Please welcome Professor Янис Варуфакис.
Let me begin by thanking you profusely for being here, thanking the university and the Department of Economics, the students who organized this. For somebody who spent his entire life in universities, either as a student or as an academic, and who came to politics very late in the piece, in 2015, I can assure you that the transition from the academy to politics is a cruel one. The fundamental cruelty is that when we are in this context, when we are in an academic seminar, when we're in class, you have a process by which, as academics, we state hypotheses, and our colleagues have a holy duty of shooting them down. And any hypothesis that survives that process has some degree of fitness, of evolutionary fitness. Not that it is the truth, but it's likely that it is approaching the truth. Whereas when you think of the pain of being on a television panel amongst politicians, as a politician yourself. Now, just for a moment, imagine that you are representing some party, okay? And your interlocutor from an opposite party says something smart, which you hadn't thought of. Suddenly you agree, but what you agree with now goes against the grain of your own party. If you admit it, you are out. You're out, you're finished. This is why you have an inbuilt process of a dialogue of the deaf in politics. Until and unless politics starts becoming more like the academy rather than the academy becoming more like politics, we are never going to restore democracy to the pedestal that it deserves. So I'm very pleased to escape politics, because you heard that I am a professor. I'm not really a professor. I am, I have the title. My professorial position now is suspended officially while a member of parliament, and I am in this murky, cruel world of politics. But whenever I can escape and be in a university environment like this, I do it. Sometimes I do it incognito. I go back to my own university and, either listen to people talk or give a sneak lecture without anybody knowing, just to get a dose of academic freedom. So enjoy your academic freedom, use it, do not squander it, and do not allow anyone to take it away from you. This is a duty that you have. Now, I was asked not to stray away from the main theme of this lecture series, and I'm very pleased not to stray. The theme being pluralism in economics, or pluralist economics. Allow me to start with a kind of devil's advocate question. Why do we need pluralism in economics? You would never have physicists gathering in this great amphitheater discussing pluralism in physics. You don't need pluralism in physics. But why is it that you don't need pluralism in physics, and you may need it in economics? Well, because economics is not like physics. And what is the profound difference? If you look at the curricula of economics departments, I'm sure, I don't know this particular department, I'm sure it's similar. If you look at textbooks, if you look at mainstream articles published in Econometrica and Journal Political Economy, it's not obvious that economics is not like physics. You start with assumptions, you build theorems, you prove the theorems, you have lemmas, and then usually somebody, maybe not the same author, collects some data and tests empirically, econometrically, mostly, the reduced forms of the equations that derive from the theorems. Isn't that what physicists do? More or less. But the profound difference, allow me to say, between economics and physics is that in physics, the phenomenon doesn't give a damn about our models of the phenomenon. So a meteorologist does not have to worry that the weather may change its ways because he or she has made a particular prediction. Whereas in social science, whether it's sociology, economics, whatever, the phenomenon really cares about our theories about the phenomenon. Because our theories have a capacity to alter our behavior in accordance to the theory. So you get, to put it in statistical terms, you get a plethora of false positives and false negatives. Let me just give you an example. Suppose that our friend here is a financier, an analyst of the financial markets, with an impeccable record of correct predictions of the financial markets. By the way, there's never existed such a person in the history of capitalism. Nobody has ever predicted systematically and with any degree of consistency, only by accident. It's like Marxists like myself, capitalism is going to have a crisis. At some point, capitalism has a crisis. You see, I was right. Okay? That's not science, right? But let's assume that our friend here is such a mythical person. And let's say that after tonight, we go out to the pub, to the restaurant, whatever, we have a few drinks, and she gets tipsy. And she tweets in her state of merriment that tomorrow the stock exchange is going to crash. To the extent that her reputation is a good one, the stock exchange is going to crash. That's not because the theory was good. She was drunk. But it is because the stock exchange responds to our theories of it and our predictions based on who has actually made the predictions. Excuse me. I've got a terrible cold. And it's not of a Chinese variety. That's a false positive, what I just described, but there are false negatives as well. Suppose you are a remarkable traffic system designer, modeler, and in the same way that a meteorologist or a financial expert has a model, a mathematical model embedded in a computer, in the case of the meteorologist to predict the weather, given input of data from different weather stations and satellites and so on, you have data coming in from various roads and sensors measuring traffic flows. And you have a mathematical model in there that churns out predictions about, Google Maps does this all the time these days. You don't even need a very sophisticated model, right? And let's say on the basis of all this input, the excellent predictor of traffic jams comes up with the prediction that tonight at midnight in Stuttgart there's going to be, on that particular street, a major traffic jam. And because this person is renowned for his capacity to predict traffic jams, let's say that the radio stations and the television stations of the local area transmit it. There's not going to be a traffic jam there. But is it because the theory was bad, or was it because people believed that it was correct and that they didn't go? So that is a false negative. That interdependence between the phenomenon under study and our theory of it. Think about it. All those theories about efficient markets, the theories about the real business cycle, the theory of rational expectations, those of you who have studied economics, those became part and parcel of the ideology of post-1971 capitalism, an ideology that crashed and burned together with Lehman Brothers in 2008. But those theories really altered the way financiers thought. They did believe. Alan Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, truly believed, he acknowledged that later, that he had believed that those theories worked and therefore markets could not fail the way they did. And then he came out in a Senate committee and did his mea culpa. He said, my model of the world crashed and burned that day, the day Lehman Brothers collapsed. So that is why we need pluralism in economics, one reason. Because we don't have empirical means by which to ascertain the quality of our hypothesis. One may say that, well, what exactly is econometrics all about? Well, let me tell you my experience of what econometrics is all about. My PhD was in microeconometrics at the time when microeconometrics had not been invented yet. So I had very micro level data from individual negotiations between employers and trades unions from the United States. And there was a contest of faculties between an MIT professor, Hank Farber was his name, who had published an article in the American Economic Review in which he claimed to prove that employers, companies, boards of directors, CEOs, are smart, intertemporal optimizers, and unions are dumb, mechanistically behaving resistors to what the firm is doing. So he had a very complicated intertemporal optimization model where the firm was maximizing its long-term profits smartly, like an impeccable computer, and the workers were silly. They simply asked for 5% pay rise, and then if a strike happened, after a week they would settle for 3, 2 weeks they would settle for 2.5, 4 weeks they will settle for anything. And this was a mechanical resistant, non-optimizing behavior. Okay? And he did the mathematics was splendid. The microeconometrics was very, very good. He was using very sophisticated maximum likelihood estimation techniques back then. And he showed that the model, right, produces a reduced form equation that fits with the data. He said, no, proof. So my PhD was really very simple. I stood this model on its head and said, imagine that we have trades unions that are very smart, and they're maximizing their intertemporal aggregate wages. And the employer is stupid and resists mechanically. He offers 0.5% pay rise. If there is a strike for a week, it goes up to 1%, so exactly the opposite. And you know what happened? The model behaved or fitted the data just as well. What does this mean? It means that the data and the empirics cannot settle the ideological question. Of course, neither of those models was close to the truth, because neither the employers nor the unions are super rational, neither the employers nor the unions are dumb. What happens when neither of them are fully dumb or fully smart? We have no idea, because the mathematics cannot be solved. That's what got me into game theory. Okay? So the second reason why we need pluralism is because, unlike in physics where you have laboratory conditions that can test precisely the relationship between the data and the theory, because you design the experiment in such a way to control exactly what you want in order to try out all the different configurations of the theory that can predict and fit the data. In economics we don't. But you will say, but we have experimental labs. I know. I spent 10 years doing experiments in laboratories. It was great fun. There were two problems with it. First, whenever I came up with a result that had empirical regularity and could be replicated again and again and again, you know what some of my fellow economists said? All you've proven is that this is how people behave in your lab. Which is not untrue, right? You can't do this in physics. If molecules, perform in a particular way in a lab, that's it. It settles the issue. We move on, right? Second objection. Some of you who have suffered economics, right, will have heard of the theory of expected utility theory. It's a particular model of how people behave under conditions of risk. Now, we know from countless experiments in labs that expected utility theory doesn't work. It's a beautiful theory, but there are countless examples of where it fails to predict how people will behave. Do you know what most economists do? You say, that's because they are not rational enough. So it's not, you see, think of this, what it means. It means that in the end, in the lab, you do not test the theory. You test the subjects. You assume, you can easily escape, and it's not completely mad, because, if you take a bunch of idiots in a lab and you ask them to do mathematical, a bit of arithmetic, and they get all the arithmetic wrong, this is not the fault of arithmetic. It's because you have idiots. Right? But if you have economic experiments where, in the end, you are judging the subject, not testing the theory, then you're not testing the theory. Let me give you another reason. Even when we don't disagree about numbers, we can have huge disagreements about how to interpret them. Disagreements that cannot be settled empirically because the numbers are common. Let me give you an example. Suppose you go to, you're in Africa somewhere, and you observe the political economy of a small village. It's a village which is on the verge of subsistence, between subsistence and hunger and poverty. And there are good years and bad years. Good crops, bad crops. And let's say that during the years of the good crops, the supply is high, price drops in the local market where they take their wheat, whatever it is, corn that they produce. But nevertheless, the total revenue is sufficient, divided per family, for them to buy enough rice or whatever it is that they eat, sweet potatoes, in order to be just above subsistence level. In the bad years, produce is not enough, so we have a really tough time for these villages. At least, however, because supply is low, the price is higher. So they make up some of the losses from the drop in quantity by means of the rise in price. Okay? So, on average, they are just at subsistence. Average between good years and bad years. Now suppose that one year, a middleman comes during the good times, during the bumper harvest, and buys a quantity, the excess produced during the good year, and stores it in some warehouse. Right? By doing this, and why would he do this? He would do it in order to sell during the bad year. But then, what happens is, supply rises because of the wheat that is being provided during the bad year. So the farmers, during the bad year, suffer the loss in quantity without the gain in price. And then they starve. Right? Let's say that we agree on the numbers. We just did the analysis. We are all in agreement. Now compare and contrast two different interpretations. One interpretation is this middleman, on the strength of his capital, the fact that he has some money that allows him to buy a part of the produce during the good years, is profiting at the expense of pushing, on average, that village below the level of subsistence. He should be forced, either through price controls, taxation, or legislation, to stop doing this. Interpretation number two. The middleman is providing a service to society. Because by buying during the good years and selling during the bad years, he's stabilizing price. And to the extent that the bakers in the local towns requires price stability, he's offering a service. So, do you see what I mean? Here you've got the same situation. The same numbers. We are not disagreeing on the numbers. Right? It's not even a theoretical difference, but there is a political difference. There is an ethical difference. You have to choose, as a political economist, as a citizen, whether price stability is more important than the fact that some people starve. That is an ethical issue. That is why economics can never be a science. And that is why we need pluralism. Because if you teach only the second interpretation, or only the first interpretation to your students, you are doing them a major disservice. Unlike the physicist who can never do students a major disservice as long as he or she is good at taking the results from the lab and transferring them into a beautiful lecture theater like this one here. This is why whenever I taught economics to first years, especially first years, I made a point of presenting every major school of thought I could imagine. The neoclassical school of thought, the ordoliberal, in German terms, school of thought, the Hayekian school of thought, Schumpeterian school of thought, Keynes, Marx. And every time I presented one particular interpretation of capitalism, I would present it as if my life depended on convincing the students that it was the correct one. And then the next day, in the next lecture, or the next week, I would do the same thing with the opposite school. Now, that confused my Asian students in Australia. And some of my Greek students. Because they would say, but professor, you just taught us something else last week. Which is the correct one? And I would say, that's for you to decide. I said, no. We're students, you're the professor, you tell us which is the right one. That's the first lesson, the first piece of education. No, there is no authority, there is no expert in pointing out which school of thought is right or not. It's like in philosophy. Can you imagine what a terrible professor of philosophy one would have to be to give a Kantian view of the world and say everything else is rubbish, and not to teach Hegel or David Hume? Economics is much closer to philosophy than it is to science. And unless you understand that, we are doing ourselves and our students a major disservice. So, again, speaking as a former professor, I think the optimal way of teaching economics, in a way that honors the students and honors the whole breadth, width, and richness of the economic discipline, is, especially at the beginning of students' careers, to teach simultaneously economic history and the progression of economic ideas. That is, when professors try to teach the concept of opportunity cost or the division of labor, as if it is an abstract clinical thing, you can do it. But students will be bored, and they will miss out on the importance of the context that gave rise to these concepts in Adam Smith. And unless you explain why Adam Smith happened in the 1770s, because there was an industrial revolution happening at the River Clyde just below his office. And he had to explain to his students what on earth was going on. And he had to explain to his students that, see those factories by the River Clyde where 12-year-olds work 20 hours a day in there? That's the beginning of the good society. And they said to them, you're a moral philosopher. How can you say that, the exploitation of these kids is the beginning of the good society? And then he comes out with unintended consequences. That these industrialists who are exploiting the kids are terrible people. But by pursuing their own greed, without realizing it, they are bringing about the facilitation of the public interest. I'm not saying that I agree with that, but unless you put it in this historical context. So, let's teach our students economic history, effectively how capitalism came into being, and how the crisis of capitalism, moral crisis, economic crisis, financial crisis, unemployment crisis, begot concepts. Keynes could never have come up with the fallacy of composition if it was not for 1929. It's really very simple. So anybody who tries to teach Keynes without what happened in 1929, effectively does a great deal of disservice to Keynes and to the world. Now, from an economics without capitalism, let me explain that. When you look at a textbook, standard textbook of economics, well, at least when I look at one, there is no capitalism in it. There is demand and supply. There is a process leading to equilibrium. The prices and quantities going up and down. There are markets. Capitalism, I never find. I look for it. I've looked for it all my life. It wasn't there. And let me explain why. Even those of you who have not studied economics, you must have seen the diagram of the demand and the supply curve, right? Prices, imagine now, I don't have it on the board, thank God for that. The vertical axis is price, the horizontal axis is quantity, you have demand curve, downward sloping, upward sloping supply curve, and the professor says equilibrium is where they meet. That's where the price at which demand equals supply. Okay, very powerful visual tool, okay? And then the tragedy begins. Because the poor professor has to explain what happens when a situation, how do prices change? They say, if demand increases, if people, for some reason, the tastes of customers change, suddenly they want to buy more for a given price of whatever it is, balloons, right? Then the whole demand curve goes up. And then the price follows up. Hang on a second. That cannot be supported mathematically. Why? Because those demand curves and supply curves are there, all other things being equal. If they are not equal, that is prices of other goods, incomes. Huh? But if all other things are not, if all other things are not the same, then those demand curves move anyway. So for instance, when you're buying coffee, this is a standard example, okay, and the price of tea changes, or the price of something else that some substitute, then the demand curve changes. But if the demand curve for coffee goes up and the price goes up, the price of tea will change. The price of tea will change, your demand curve will shift again. So it will be like a cat chasing its tail. So you can't tell a story about the change in prices in real time. So, poor professors, feel for them. They have to tell a story based on hypothetical reasoning. They have to tell you a story. Compare and contrast the two different sentences. Demand goes up and price follows. That involves time. You're not allowed to do it if you want to be correct mathematically. So what do you say? Okay, this is where demand is and this is where price is. Had the demand curve been somewhere else, the price would have been somewhere else. This is called comparative statics. This is all we teach students. But it's very difficult to tell them you're not allowed to speak in terms of time. So time does not exist in any of the microeconomics textbooks. In any of the microeconomics textbooks, anybody who speaks of time is wrong. Should be immediately either fired as a professor or failed as a student. Okay? So there is no time. And there is no money. Think about it. If you have a mathematical model of a system of n equations, and you have n plus 1 or n plus 2 unknowns, you can't solve it. If you have an economy, let's say, with two goods, machines and corn, to make it simple, then you have a system of two equations, and the unknowns are the two prices. Okay? Sort of manageable, especially if you have 20 equations and 20 unknowns. But to bring money in as a separate entity, you have to add another equation. So you will have n plus 1 equation, n plus 1 unknowns and n equations. You can't solve it. So that's why in microeconomics, in general equilibrium theory, money is impossible to add to the model. So there is no real time and there is no money in the economics that students learn. Most of them don't realize it because they talk about prices. They say the price of coffee. But that's not a monetary price. It's a relative price. How many grams of coffee do you get for one tea bag? But that's barter. That's an economy that is non-monetized. So all the economies in the economics textbooks that you get taught, not just in this great university, but in every university, doesn't have time in it, doesn't have money in it. Doesn't have debt either. Because if you don't have money, you don't have debt. And if you throw debt into any macroeconomic or microeconomic model, you can't solve it. So you don't have money, you don't have time, you don't have debt, then you don't have interest rates, really. And you have no risk. Because if you have no time, where is the risk if there's no time? There's no unemployment. Unless you introduce it through the back door. Because if you assume that the demand for labor is like the market for labor is like the market for potatoes, yeah? What happens in the market for potatoes? You have excess potatoes, you reduce the price of potatoes, you get rid of them. So why doesn't unemployment, which is excess supply of labor, disappear when the wage falls? Then we have to start blaming things. Because, in reality, unemployment perseveres, especially when the wages fall catastrophically, like in the Great Recession, like in the Great Depression, like in Greece. Since 2010, we had 42% reduction in wages, and unemployment was going up. It doesn't happen in the market for potatoes. You never have a situation where the price of potatoes comes down, and more potatoes are unsold. It doesn't happen. But if you are determined to model labor as if it is potatoes, then you have to say, it's the unions. The unions are resisting the reduction in the price. It doesn't allow the price of labor to fall, the wage to fall sufficiently, so it's the union's fault. And then, of course, the unions employ some other economists who say, no, it's the fault of monopolists. Because if you have monopoly or monopson in the labor market, you don't have a competitive market. So, it's a blaming game. So politics enters into the realm of bad economics. And you have bad politics and bad economics. It's not a good mix. One of the first things that students of economics learn is the ISLM model, the macroeconomic model, the simplest macroeconomic, beautiful diagram which explains the rate of interest, which of course cannot be explained macroeconomically. So, you just assume that there is such a thing as a rate of interest. But in order to even do that then, you have to assume that investment equals savings, which is perfectly true in a barter economy. If we have no money, all right, what would the point be for a farmer to set aside corn and not eat it or sell it to be eaten? The only reason why you would want to set corn aside is to use it as seeds for next year's crop. That's investment. So by definition, when you have no money, savings equals investment. But what if you have money? Because there's no reason why you should assume axiomatically that money saved will necessarily be invested. You can just put it under your bed. Or, you can put it in Deutsche Bank. Very bad idea. And then Deutsche Bank can give it to Siemens to buy back their own shares. That's not investment. The price of the share of Siemens goes up because more of them have been purchased, but there's no actual investment, no new machinery, no new jobs, no seeds in the farm. From economics without capitalism. So we have spent the last 100 years in economics developing aesthetically superlative, beautiful models of general equilibrium. I spent my youth studying them in the same way I would go to the Louvre or to the Acropolis Museum in Greece to look at the aesthetic beauty of the artworks. Totally useless from the perspective of understanding capitalism. Because there's no capitalism there. There's no money, there is no time, there is no interest rate. It does not take into account the permanent disequilibrium in the labor market, the permanent disequilibrium between investments. So everything we teach our students is irrelevant regarding capitalism. But, students constantly have to pass exams. They have to learn those models, to recapitulate them, learn them again and again and again. And then, of course, if they ever become professors, they have to teach their own students the same thing, because this is what they know. And because it's mathematically very complicated, the beauty of complicated mathematics is that it creates monopoly power. Because if you understand it and the folks out there don't, the folks out there think, I'm stupid compared to him. He must understand something I don't. And in the end, of course, I understand nothing on the basis of all the complicated mathematical modeling I've learned, because it's relevant to capitalism. It can't explain unemployment. But then, of course, I go on television and say, oh, Professor, what do you think about unemployment? Oh, it's the trade union's fault. It's the employer's fault. It's all rubbish. I mean, I may be right in what I say, but that will be in spite of the fact that I'm an economist, not because I'm an economist. Now, I'm not... At the same time, it is my strong belief that we have a duty to learn all these economic models. All of them. As long as it's pluralist. As long as we learn Keynes from the original, not the textbook, that somebody who didn't understand Keynes wrote. Yeah? Hayek, the neoclassicists. Why? Because each one of those theories fails to explain capitalism. But by studying them, we explore the limits of human reason. We come, crashing onto the wall of our incapacity to seriously understand the beautiful indeterminacy that is the capitalist beast. And when you study the neoclassical model, you hit one wall. You study the Marxist model, you hit another wall. You study the Keynesian model, you hit another wall. Hit as many walls as you can. Because then you have a capacity to rise above all these theories, set them aside. Your logic, your mind, your faculties will have been trained sufficiently, as long as you realize that the truth of capitalism is not in those equations, and you will have a capacity to then have maybe have a chance, an iota of a smidgen of a possibility of saying something sensible, which will not be provable. The one thing that I've learned from Keynes, people ask me to, I don't know who has read The General Theory. It's an impossible book. It's lovely, it's very well written, okay? But it's completely, one chapter contradicts another chapter. Sometimes it's so wonderful, the prose, that I don't know what it means. And one thing I've learned from Keynes, if I'm to sum up what Keynes said and what I've learned from Keynes, do you know what it is? We are damned if we know. We're damned if we know. We have no idea why markets fail. All we know is that they have a tendency to fail. And when they fail, we have to do something about it. And markets will not fix themselves. That is a celebration of the beautiful indeterminacy and horrific indeterminacy of capitalism.